NAAMSA's SA Auto Week is the largest trade show of its kind in South Africa. This year, Cars.co.za was the official media partner of the event, and we set up this rather stylish podcast studio. Our very own Chiro de Siena and guest journalist from CNBC Africa, Fifi Peters, played hosts and over 3 days interviewed all the key figures in South Africa's motoring industry.
Earlier this week, Transunion released its latest vehicle pricing index. It essentially measures the relationship between new and used car prices. But joining us to tell us a little bit more about this relationship and what it means in the broader scheme of things is Lee Naik. He's the CEO at Transunion Africa. Lee, thanks so much for taking the time at SA Auto Week to join the Cars.co.za podcast.
It's a pleasure to join you. Thank you.
Hope you are feeling comfortable in our booth. But let's talk about the VPI. In essence, what is it and what does the latest data that you have released indicate about what's happening in the car market?
Well, the Vehicle Pricing Index has been around for over a decade. And what it tries to do is understand the correlation between used cars and new cars. So the industry typically goes through cycles. People either buy used cars for a period and then they transition to new cars. What we're looking to figure out is the demand for used cars and new cars, and also look at the pricing of new cars versus used cars. Clearly, there's some kind of formula or strategy that dealerships and OEMs, the guys that make the cars, apply when they go about pricing their vehicles. And if you start to understand the data, understand what's happening with consumers, their indebtedness, their household pressures, and allows business leaders that run the industry to make judicious calls. When we start to get into the minds of the consumer, we can adjust our strategies as well.
Let's talk specifically then about pricing and what the latest report is telling us about pricing and trends, specifically between used cars and new cars right now.
Well, the first thing to note is that we just completed September, and NAAMSA, where we are at NAAMSA's SA Auto Week, reported a 5.8% decline in sales when compared to the previous year. In fact, it's been going for many quarters, this trend of a decline in sales. What the VPI tells us is that we measure something called the used to new car ratio. And what we found when you compare these 2 quarters, quarter on quarter, is that the ratio has gone up. And what that means is that people are buying more used cars than new cars. So what does it mean practically? It means that it's quite difficult to access new car financing, number one, right? It's a difficult environment. We've just had a 25 basis point decrease in interest rates, but it's not enough. So what does it mean not enough for the average consumer listening to the podcast? We always think of the average consumer having a R1 million home loan and a 350,000 Rand car. On the back of the decrease of interest rates just a few weeks ago, that average consumer with a R1 million home loan and a 350,000 Rand car is paying 314 Rands less a month. Now, it's significant in a household, but is it significant enough? Because we've been having interest rate increases for many months, right? In fact, the last time we had any decrease or movement was May 2023. So what we're starting to see in the data has a physical manifestation. It means that it's difficult to access a new car deal. Dealerships, finance houses are much more prudent as to the customers that they want. Also, there's much more value in used cars currently. What we found as early as the pandemic was that we reevaluated our priorities as households. So what we would do is, in many households, we had 2 cars. Prior to the pandemic, suddenly we're not driving our cars. And we asked the question, why do we have cars? We saw that many households have moved away from 2 sedans to 1 crossover SUV.
Sure.
So what we find is generally there's been a demand for used cars because there's more utility. There's nothing wrong with the car physically. Can I get more life out of it? And suddenly, if I need 2 cars, if I had 1 car, I'd prefer to have a crossover or a mid-size SUV.
Sure.
And what you then see is that the biggest pricing increases, which is what the VPI index tracks, is in this middle-size vehicle, mid-size crossover SUV. So in the end, what is the summary? The VPI index has told us it's a tough place out there. People are looking for utility in the money that they have today, and the best bang for their buck they can get is in the used car market. We're hoping for better days. And there's a second question to ask. What does it mean for the industry? But for the consumer, it means that we're being prudent. We're still holding back. In technical terms, we call this deleveraging. We're asking ourselves the question, do I really need this? Or can I wait for better days? And the reality is that when we talk to consumers, we've just done a recent consumer pulse survey. The millennials and the Gen Zs, right, those born after 1981, they make up about 40 to 50% of all finance deals in South Africa at the moment. They believe that their finances will improve drastically over the next 12 months. They've seen the first interest rate cut and they believe more is coming.
Sure.
So there's a hope for better days, but I think we've seen prudency in not making those tough calls and having further debt at this stage.
I think I want to go back to the second question that you asked.
Yes.
That I should have asked, but you did my job for me. Just in terms of how the industry should respond to what you are seeing right now, this dynamic whereby you are seeing a whole lot more demand for used cars because of the fact that times are tough. On the other side, you're also seeing a millennial or a Gen Z consumer who is one of the largest consumers in the market right now. Square that for us in terms of what it means for how players, the OEMs, should respond.
It's a great question. So there's two things to think about in your question. One, the mindset of a person born after 1981 is very different to a Gen X or a Boomer. In fact, we found that in all the data we've had over the last few years, that the Gen Xers, which I am, unfortunately, or the Boomers,
Why unfortunate?
or the Boomers after that. I look young, but I'm actually older, it seems. But actually, Gen X and Boomers have actually pulled back. They realize that a purchase to buy a vehicle is not the best choice right now. However, a youngster born after 1981 realizes that in a market with an unemployment rate of 33.5% and a lack of public infrastructure for transportation, we need to get mobile. We need to get mobile to access jobs, to access community. We can't just sit in our townships and not move. So we're seeing a conviction amongst people. And they tell us in the data, we believe the next 12 months will be better. They start and say, well, let me get access to a car, any car. A car will move me from point A to point B. Does it need to be red, yellow, does it need stripes? It doesn't matter. In fact, the future of mobility isn't about the kind of car. The future of mobility is the movement of people between places. And that's a trend in itself we can talk about later. But what does it mean for the OEMs and the dealer groups and the vehicle asset finance? This is where the cyclical nature of the used and new car market comes in. When we have the position where inventory, meaning the stocks that new cars have, are lying in yards and in warehouses around the country, in the end, the consumer benefits. As we go into quarter four and towards the end of the year, you will inevitably find these dealer groups offering better deals for the consumer.
Sure.
It could be a year free fuel. It could be better financing, which you're starting to see right now, prime less X% for a certain deal. So the cycle then says the consumer will start to see better deals to move the stock that isn't moving off the floor into the hands of the consumer. So what does it mean? Well, interest rates are starting to decrease. That 314 rands I spoke about, more is coming. And as these deals become more compelling, you then see the move again from the used cars back into new cars.
Okay.
So that's the trend you'll see changing soon.
Okay. No, it sounds like a better days on the horizon, particularly for motorists or consumers who are in the market right now. Lee, a big theme, as you would know, of this Auto Week this year is the heritage and the history of the sector in South Africa, marking 100 years. With that, it's the close watch and the disruption that the newer entrants have brought into the market as well, most notably from China and India. Just your thoughts on the long-term impact then of the new entrants on the incumbents.
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's a privilege being at NAAMSA's SA Auto Week. It's the 100th year celebration of the industry. Coincidentally, the 100th day anniversary of the GNU, and just over 200 days of having electricity with no load shedding. So it's a great week to be in Cape Town. But it's a great question to ask as to what we're seeing. So from a new entrant perspective, what we're seeing is that there has been a growth in quarter 2 of electric vehicle sales in South Africa, some 5%. But it's still very nascent, meaning it's still starting. We're still talking about a year-to-date number of EVs sold closer to 7,500 vehicles. That's it. Now, in the bigger scheme of things, globally, 14 million EVs were sold. 7,500 doesn't move the needle. But what it tells us, though, is that there's a move to think differently about vehicles and mobility. As I mentioned, the biggest growth of vehicle asset finance is in the millennials and the Gen Z born after 1981. And what that tells us, they think differently about sustainability, about the earth, about movement between places, and that utility they seek for may come from EVs. It gives them the ability to give back to the earth, to participate in protecting our earth, which is a huge thing for this specific generational group. So we start to see that thinking happening. But why is the increases happening, and where's the disruption coming from? We just saw a few days ago that BYD, a Chinese brand, has launched in South Africa with their third iteration after the Atto and the Dolphin. They've now launched something called the BYD Sail. Very compelling, full house spec vehicle. And these vehicles can now go up to 500 kilometers. And the initial concern about electric vehicles was, one, South Africa has no stable electricity. So 200 days into no load shedding, that's interesting. What does it mean? And then the second thing is that this is what we call range anxiety. So the research tells us globally that there's a golden number of the number of kilometers you got to travel without charging that makes you want to buy a car. And that number is 437, right? A local player did a similar survey recently, and they found the number to be closer to 500. So as you get to this 437 to 500 and vehicles start to deliver those ranges, which is starting to happen right now, higher end vehicles from high-end luxury brands to a BYD from China is starting to get into the range of 450 to 500. You have less range anxiety, less ability to worry about breaking down and move your car. And then the price point is important. A player like China that last year exported 4 million vehicles, of which 1.2 million were actually EVs, is a compelling proposition in a market where China controls the entire value chain of building an EV, from strategy to design to batteries to subsidies to taxes.
Sure.
It is highly a government enforced strategy to become an EV global player. And last year, China outsold the United States when it came to electric vehicles. So what we can see as South Africa being part of the BRICS group of countries and our relationship with China is probably more vehicles coming from China, but at the very same time, existing local OEMs, of which there are 55, will feel the pressure. And hopefully consumers win by getting better deals in EVs going forward. So early days, there is some growth, not enough to move the needle, still sub 8,000 vehicles year to date.
Sure.
But I think EVs are a force to be reckoned with in future, but not right now. The price point is not the one that customers want. In fact, customers tell us that they're looking for a vehicle that's closer to 500,000 rands before they really jump the boat and go from ICE vehicles or engine-based vehicles into EVs.
Which was going to be my next question, just in terms of the more conscious motorist that you were also describing there, who's aware of some of these environmental factors and the role that they also have to play in trying to reduce emissions, and perhaps that role being by the kind of car that they drive. But then the price is, most people find it's unaffordable, particularly in this environment. With that said, do you think that there's anything that other stakeholders in the pricing value chain can do, like the financiers, the banks that provide the finance for it? Are there, in your view, any innovative financing models that could be put on the table to encourage greater adoption of EVs?
Well, it's a great question, but let me split it up. I think in terms of EVs, we have very early stage regulations. In fact, we've recently talked about an EV policy coming in late last year from the former minister of DTIC. And what it means is that we should see more support for an EV industry. South Africa exports a lot of its vehicles. To protect our industry, we'll need subsidies because Europe, for example, has a deadline of 2035 to cut over from ICE vehicles, engine-based vehicles, to EVs. So to protect our industry, more can be done from a government level, starting with regulations, starting with subsidies at a governmental level to drive the industry from a DTIC perspective. And then secondly, more can be done from a finance perspective to drive the EV industry per se. But maybe to transition to your question on how do you make it more accessible, I mentioned at the outset that mobility is less about cars and more about the movement of people. One of the growing trends globally is what we call micromobility. And micromobility is the movement of people using all manners of transportation, from a physical bicycle to an e-bike to an e-scooter to a smaller car. Mm-hmm. You've seen more recently ride-hailing companies in South Africa that suddenly have these tiny yellow vehicles, Bajajs on the roads that look like they're about to fall over.
Yeah,
right?
I'm not a fan,
right?
Personally.
But you today always are occupied. Because what you're doing is, in a population that can't afford to go into the vehicle that you could, or choose the Uber or the Lyft or the Bolt option you could, it's giving them access to mobility. Mm-hmm. Now, we call this category of innovation mobility as a service.
Sure.
So for a person that can't access traditional finance to lease a car or rent a car, we're giving them the option to subscribe to a car. You could buy a car for a month, for a day, for a week. You can give it back when it stops being affordable. This forces innovation on behalf of the people that make the cars, the people that want to finance the cars, because in a market where everybody can't afford to access cars, and let's be real, 33.5% is the unemployment rate. We have a low GDP growth. We have stretched disposable income today. We've got to find a way to bring this access to mobility to the people. And MAS is actually the way we do it. There are players like FlexCarb and a few other players that are starting to offer the option to access mobility as a service.
Sure.
And the big thing to kind of concretize in our minds is that mobility is movement between points, less about the vehicle and the mode and the manner and who owns it. Ownership will be less important. Mm-hmm. I've got a 14-year-old daughter and a 16-year-old son. They have no idea what their favorite car is. In fact, my daughter's favorite part about the car is that it has cup holders. Right? Okay. Because the youngsters, the Gen Zs and Alphas, where my kids now fit in, are the ones that are less concerned about where the car industry is going or the color. They want utility in movement. It accesses opportunity, accesses social, accesses community. It's less about the vehicle, which is scary for us at Cars.co.za. It's scary for us as a broader industry, but we need to catch on to the movement and the trends in the industry for us to be relevant as an industry going forward.
I think a perfect point to park the conversation. Scary, but exciting as well, just in terms of the insights that you have shared with us about the future of mobility, as you've put it. But Lee, thanks so much for your time and enjoy the rest of Car Week.
Thanks so much for having me.
What's the car with Cars.co.za? Yes, just look at Zonda and his XXX pics. One arm on the steering wheel and the other flexing those puppies in his side mirror. Yeah, but now think of a car, any car. Yes, we have it. Cars.co.za. Let's find what moves you.